Have you anticipated this much like response and reaction to this?
No, I'm really surprised. I think when we first found them, we had no idea that they'd be really historically significant. We're finding out that they are, and that's why, we're taking the time to make sure every page is, digitally preserved for the future.
So what's next?
I think we have to tell this story.
This is the end of a journey. Behind this door is something that waited more than 70 years to be discovered. We can't begin our story at the end. This story begins here, 2009, the Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is Casey, and today several papers fell out of a book that will change the course of her life and ultimately prove to be of great historical significance.
This is my grandmother's hand-typed chronology, and this is what started this journey. My grandmother passed in 1997. It's weird, I thought I knew everything there was to know about my late grandmother. But when I knew my grandmother, she was running a craft store in Verona. She had started a children's daycare center, but I had never heard of outlines. It says outlines dates 1941 to 1947, a listing of artists who are, very recognizable. So notorious that even I knew who they were. I'm never majored in art and history. I'm not very well versed on the subject at all. But I recognize names like Braque, Calder, Chagall, Kandinsky, Klee, Picasso. And I remember very vividly looking at this list and also seeing, an address in downtown Pittsburgh. It's kind of piecing together that this may have been some sort of gallery. And then I scan down and actually see my late grandmother's name. And I had never known her to be an artist, so I was really curious as to why her name would appear on the list of artists from the 1940s. I immediately went to my Aunt Kathy, who was Betty's middle child.
I was born in 1947, so I really missed out on the gallery per se. I was too young to remember it at all, but I lived with the gallery. My parents bought art from the gallery, and they were part of our lives. Not just things on the wall, but it was also music and furniture and a whole approach to life that was very holistic in her belief in the importance of art. I would say that my mother and father both felt that art was incredibly significant in the very broadest sense of art, and we lived with it every day. I mean, the Cornell box, we played with, and the David Smith sculpture was a stage for our doll play. When we saw family movies, it was not just our family movies; it was also Maya Deren films and films from the Museum of Modern Art that exposed us to a bigger world. As I say, I was too young to remember outlines, but my mother kept scrapbooks, meticulous scrapbooks of every event, every moment, and they were very important to her. So we could look through those, and she would talk about some of the artists and some of the work. We heard that my Calder had come and done his circus, and my dad got to roar for the lion. I was really impressed with that. But my mother became ill, and she stopped communicating in the last years of her life, and I realized I had missed an opportunity. One of her last interviews was with our friend Florence Rosner, and she kind of did the history of outlines, but after that it was really hard for my mother to communicate, which is why I decided that I needed to take a video of my dad and record his memories, and my Aunt Marion and my Aunt Eleanor, because I couldn't get my mother's anymore. And boy, did I miss her voice.
Oh.
Outlines was not just a gallery, but showcased books and films and a record library long before the works were available anywhere else in the city.
Initially, we looked at all these names and realized we have to get all of these names on a paper or some surface so that we can see them in order, and quite literally begin the process of tracking down where these artists are, if they were still alive and well, and contacting every single one of them in the hopes that they'd be willing to sit down with us and tell us, share their memories of outlines.
Despite the list of more than 100 artists who exhibited at Outlines, only 4 were alive and well and willing to share their memories of the gallery.
Orrin found out that there was a new art gallery that was going to be opened.
I went down to the gallery, and it hadn't opened yet. She was planning to open it probably a month or so. She was painting the walls. She had a friend whom she went to school with who was helping her rehabilitate this storeroom on Boulevard of the Allies downtown.
And when he walked in, she took one look at your father and said, "That's for me." She said he was so gorgeous, and he was. And so from that point on, they were very friendly. And then when your mother had the opening of Outlines, and there was publicity on it, and they sent out invitations, and it was catered. And Sydney was there, and Orrin was there. Anyhow, they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and they had all this food, and no one came in. Not one single solid person.
How sad.
And so they ate as much of the stuff as they could, but it shows your mother's determination. That didn't stop her from going on with Outlines. And she was very innovative and brought things to Pittsburgh that nobody had knew about.
There are several artists in Pittsburgh that I know of who knew my grandmother long after Outlines had closed, but still may be able to shed some light on what the gallery was.
I knew your grandmother fairly well when she had the store in Verona. Y'all called her Betty. Everyone called, at least, I don't know of anyone that called her Elizabeth. You would have said Elizabeth Rockwell. I don't know if I'd have known who you were talking about, but Betty, everyone knew. Yeah, and she was highly respected, you know, as a very individual and very extremely knowledgeable, you know. So it was sort of like a learning experience for me. A lot of people probably, particularly young people, never knew such an experiment ever existed. This is an amazing event, you know, that such an institution was in Pittsburgh at a time when it was seemed really a vanguard and extremely risky to launch something like this, and by a young woman, I think, which has to be historic, you know.
To find out just how historic and how significant the Outlines Gallery is, Casey and her family leave for New York City to check in with some rock stars of the art world.
Okay, so I sent you a list of like the many artists who performed and lectured. Were there any names that you found like really intriguing, knowing that, you know, what you know about art history? Or
Yeah, I mean, I was astonished. I mean, it's just a who's who of the major artists of the first half of the 20th century. There had been a certain amount of traction for avant-garde art and modern art in New York. Particularly, it started in 1913 with the Armory Show, and it picked up steam when the Museum of Modern Art opened in 1929. But so by 1940, there's been a tiny bit of acceptance of this, again, of avant-garde and modern art in New York. But outside of New York, it would have been almost completely unknown. So that made her willingness to show this art in the face of must have been, you know, universal criticism. There was a small percentage of the population that understood modern and contemporary art and appreciated it. Most of those people were artists or very visionary collectors, but most people were scratching their heads, you know, the usual, my kid could do that kinds of criticism, and partly just because it was new. Nobody had ever seen anything quite like it. And I mean, in some ways that's what made it exciting, because it was people fighting the status quo, and a small portion of the people were appreciating them, but they were fighting against the grain of the conservative art taste at the time. So, I mean, you have to realize that at the time, the most famous artists that people respected were people like Thomas Hart Benton and John Stewart Curry. You know, people were doing, not to disparage those works, but you know, they were very, in some ways, very conservative. The one thing that she probably benefited by, that women have always been more accepted in the arts than in perhaps other fields, and you've seen it throughout the 20th century. But you know, later on, you'll have galleries opened by Peggy Guggenheim and Betty Parsons, and later on Paula Cooper, Barbara Gladstone. But even then, for her time, 1941, she's arguably one of the most groundbreaking women in the art scene.
After learning that Outlines most certainly is of great historical importance, it was time to sit down with the remaining rebels themselves.
I'm still fighting.
oh my goodness. So I would think that in the way that, you know, I would think that that struggle would have been long gone, that people,
Oh, no.
I mean,
No, these works can't be shown in a great many places in the United States.
I had no idea.
When I first began exhibiting, there was always an emphasis on the ugliness. and attractiveness of the models and so forth, which I was totally uninterested in. I was trying to use modernism as the basis for looking again at an area that had been, painting, realism, that had been totally pushed aside. It was called Carnegie Tech, now it's Carnegie Mellon University. But the faculty there was very interesting, especially for two people. One was a man named Robert Lepper, who was very, very advanced in his thinking, and Balcom Green and his wife. Balcom was very important at Carnegie Tech when I went back on the GI Bill after I got out of the Army in 1946. I went back to Carnegie Tech. But Balcom Green and his wife, who called herself Peter Green, she was they were both wonderful artists, but they were quite different as artists. But once a week they held, in the art department, he didn't teach painting, he just taught art history surveys, and would have a discussion group at their home, which was on the campus. And we'd go there and then a discussion would develop. But we weren't talking about current events. Politics never came into it. It was all about what was happening in contemporary art. And I think we went to the outlines as an extension of this, what Balcom Green was doing with these discussion groups. They say I didn't know about the place until the end of 1946 or 47. The place was filled with folding chairs because I think the first time I went there was a concert and talk given by John Cage. I can't remember what was on the walls because that wasn't the focus of the evening.
Yeah.
And of course, Andy Warhol was part of our group. His name was Warhola.
I was curious to know if Andy had gone there and maybe seen
Well,
John
yeah, I
Cage.
remember we went together. We were always together. It was a small group of about 5 of us. We went to movies, we went to the theater. So.
And you went to Outlines.
I don't believe I am an important person.
I think a lot of people might disagree. You're going to have to live with that.
I hope so. Over in the last few years, I've achieved a certain degree of success. It's embarrassing, actually. After you've spent your life being a failure and you've gotten used to it, to suddenly find yourself popular is absolutely mystifying. I don't know how my painting came into. Did I bring it in for a show? Did I bring it in to show Betty? She may not have. I don't know. And they came into, Merce and John Cage came in and they saw the painting and it was $10 and with the frame, and they bought it. And I don't know what happened to it. He might have painted over it. He might have, because John Cage, in the later years of his life, was doing paintings, which were quite, I like what I saw, or what I saw reproduced, I like. But it's quite unusual. The whole story's unusual. I'm always amazed when things which seem to have been forgotten or been lost turn up again.
I have an idea they were mostly of a thing that I did for the Keystone newspaper. I think I was the art editor, and so there was a lot to see of art in it, and then I would, I think, also suggest visits to the museums. So it's very possible that that had to do with it.
My memory was that, and this is, we're trying to play Sidney Simon, He seems to have, maybe he was in Pittsburgh, I don't know. But he was the person who introduced Hi and then me to Betty Raphael. I remember that very vividly. And over the years, he always kept track of her. He always told Hi about what was happening. And I think he arranged that show of Hi's. That's my memory. I was very moved to read the chronology of that gallery and see that she wanted to bring all the arts together.
Well, at Outlines, and I'm not absolutely certain how often I went there, as I saw a list of the shows that were shown at that movie theater, I had seen many of them. I remember they were very good movies. They wouldn't just show any movie.
Well, at the Outlines Gallery, it was astonishing, some of the things that were shown. For instance, I remember Maya Deren. That was a clear memory I had.
Right. And I remember Maya Deren evening and her talking about her films.
Like this article that mentions Betty's relationship to Maya Deren, and this is how I found out that part of the film Ritual in Transfigured Time was actually filmed here at the home of Betty's parents in Regent Square. Maya sent Betty the outtakes from that day of filming. In the outtakes, you see the actress Rita Christiani through the scene holding a ball of yarn. Betty is actually a film subject, and you see Betty walking back and forth and Rita repeatedly dropping the ball of yarn. And if you watch the completed version of Ritual in Transfigured Time, you can see what Maya's vision may have been for how this scene would figure into the storyline.
I mean, I was amazed that she had a showing of Joseph Cornell's films. His boxes were, rare enough for anyone to show at that time, but his films are very, very experimental, and that to me shows just her courageousness to show these works as art, and I'm sure there was a great deal of consternation and criticism leveled at her for doing it.
Most of the artists, most of the shows, Betty got through galleries in New York galleries. We had a Calder show. She drove up and she had an old Buick, and she drove up to Calder's home and studio. He filled her car with sculptures, and she drove back from there and set up a show. And it was wonderful because and the whole car was just full of wire and chunks of metal and things. And of course, in those days, Calder was not known as he is today. None of the artists were.
And then on the same gong, a low tone. And of course the percussion. I was so pleased to know that Betty Rothwell was Harry's classmate back in Cranbrook, and that they really connected to the point where this is something new, and what can we learn from this? So it was all innovative and new at that time, and it still is. Actually, if we look at 1940s, Harry Bertoia had been designing the jewelry there in Cranbrook, and of course monoprints when he couldn't quite get the metals he wanted to use during wartime. But even so, with Betty introducing the Harry Bertoia early works, possibly the jewelry that he made and so forth, that was so significant because if we look at Harry Bertoia being so hidden, let's say, or subtle and not known, and what Betty was doing in Pittsburgh was revealing, and it was so great that she could do that for Harry and all these other artists.
Do you think Outlines was perhaps one of the first galleries to do an exhibition of your father's work?
Yes, as far as I know, his work was not shown in galleries or stores or any place like that. So this definitely was the first. The Outlines Gallery, Betty Rockwell, and I think her introduction of Harry's work was a seed to make it all happen and all begin. So not only the first gallery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I think the very first gallery in all the United States that showed Harry's work. And that is a breakthrough.
Here's this one. Here's a better photo of
And
your
this
face.
one here. This particular chair is the same chair as in that photograph. And the one that was in the gallery in Pittsburgh, it was brought out in 42, 41, 42, 43, beginning, and from there on throughout the war into the early 50s. And this was the one that she had bought and apparently liked. And this is the most important thing. In the Knoll book that was made some years ago is a full-page photograph, and it's there called Risom Designs, the first Knoll chair. The first one with a Knoll name on it, and that was it. So, there we are. So, it was a basically very simple chair. The main thing was that it was a chair which could be made during the war of critical materials with a minimum amount of danger that they couldn't get it. It was set up for manufacturing of as simply as possible, but also as strong as possible to last. These were used, these and regular side chairs, of which we have seen them, and tables were used in the USO canteens where the soldiers were near camp, had places they could go to and get coffee and donuts and read their hometown newspapers. They're easy to make, they're strong, and nice looking. Undoubtedly, your grandmother there had a gallery and was interested in being in on that development, so she would buy a couple or show them, and she would promote the sale of them, and that was. And it's not the first time we have heard about people who probably didn't know a great deal about it themselves, set up stores and shops and galleries, and had to try many times before people discovered them and went to buy some of their things. Now, of course, this was also during bad years, during war, and but there was very little money for this kind of thing. And then I was drafted into the army, which I shouldn't have been. I had a wife and a child, but I got drafted just the same, and that was misery.
While it was exciting to meet these iconic artists and learn more about Outlines, what was most illuminating was learning about the depth of their collective struggle.
I had taken for granted what the war meant for everybody at that time. I think that that's so foreign to us now because we are given a choice, you know, whether we're going to go into the service, and, you know, that was not an option for these artists. You know, they were just at a time where they were really, you know, coming into their own being as artists. They were suddenly expected to be soldiers. This is Betty holding her first daughter, Alexandra, and this is the photo she sent to Orrin when he was overseas during the war. he didn't even get to meet his daughter until the war ended 2 years later. And I think that really, really sort of put things in perspective for me in a new way, that this was a real time of turmoil in our, historically, and for all these new changes and how, much they were leaders, they really didn't have a choice, and their lives were just disrupted by this war.
The war came up and disrupted all of those people's lives, of course.
World War II displaced a number of European artists who came to this country.
So I was away for 2 years, 2.5 years, and my wife was there alone. It was a tough situation, and my oldest daughter, who is here now, was sick. She was 5, 6 months old.
Done something like basic training in Florida, and then we were told, all of us, and it was a New York contingent, we were all from New York, that we're going to Pittsburgh to go to radio school, to become radio operators and technicians.
So, and I got through the war and I didn't get killed, and came home again in November '45.
And you asked about the 40s. One of the things that I remember very much, the emigre artists coming during the war, they affected New York. They came here, many were brought here by Guggenheims and others, and they affected the art world. But there was a difference between the art that was being done by New Yorkers and them.
But what was so crucial during the 40s is the exposure of American artists to these the European modern movements of the the 20s and 30s. For the first time in America, people were really getting doses of Picasso and Matisse. It's part of that excitement that artists got from seeing these groundbreaking artists in the 30s and 40s that led to the Americans doing these wonderful, innovative works.
There was something new being done with art itself, and even the still life. And still lifes didn't look the same, and the buildings in New York didn't look the same.
Yeah, but it's also fascinating that this occurred during World War II, and that you started, right at the beginning of the war, and it was ended shortly after the war ended.
The fact that she stuck it through for 6 years throughout World War II, to me, is just amazing.
Rejection of modernism or modernist thinking in the United States ended with the war, and immediately modernist ideas and art flooded in. So by 1947, modernist ideas were really began to dominate what everybody was involved in, and especially in the area of design, simply took over. And probably it was the industrial designers and the architects who really made modernism legitimate in the United States.
This was considered to be defense worker housing. New Kensington was known for its aluminum at the time, so some of the finest grades of aluminum for the war effort were being made here in New Kensington, and that's what made this a very important project. So the U.S. government were going around the country and understanding kind of key places where industry was, that they need to have a kind of workforce for, and they were providing kind of modernized housing to make the living experience for people working in those industrial facilities, to make that living experience a good one, so that they would be more productive in those kind of situations. The U.S. government sought out proposals from the leading architects around the country during the war, and that this was part of the kind of war effort, that architects who were kind of in practice in the US, that weren't in active military service, were being given these commissions to do worker housing in critical sites around the country. And so I would imagine Gropius and Breuer, maybe because of their relationship and knowing Pittsburgh from the Frank House, may have influenced them to want to come back and do a project here. It's hard to know the kind of why they were selected for this specific site compared to some others. But we're fortunate they did, and we know that they have an understanding of Western Pennsylvania from that experience of working on the Frank House. I think people who first lived there were living there out of necessity, not necessarily understanding that they were living in a great piece of modern architecture. At that time, a piece of great international style architecture. They were looking at it as purely a utilitarian kind of lifestyle experience when working for the aluminum company. But I think as years go by, people from all over the world come to New Kensington to visit Aluminum City Terrace. Well, I mean, they were true pioneers, living in early examples of American modernism.
Do you think it's significant that she championed this in the beginning when she was very much in the minority and people were calling it chicken coop housing and snubbing the whole idea?
I think it's fantastic that she was a defender of modernism, defender of Aluminum City Terrace in those early days. And it's fantastic that the Outlines Gallery was showing this project and making people understand that this is not a housing project but a piece of art. And that's where I think it's great, because it is. It's a composition, it's architecture, and what is it? It's community. So the idea of kind of getting those three things to make people start to understand and become more aware of, I'm so glad she did. Well done, Betty.
Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water in Pennsylvania has been a celebrated architectural achievement since its completion in the late 1930s. Each year, 135,000 people visit this masterpiece of design, and it has been the subject of books as well as documentary films. Yet, the recent discovery of the Outlines chronology connects Edgar Kaufman, owner of Falling Water, as well as Frank Lloyd Wright himself, to Betty Rockwell. Not only was Edgar Kaufman on the board of directors at Outlines, but several of the most iconic pieces of art in the Falling Water collection were obtained from Betty Rockwell's gallery.
If we look historically, I suppose it would be the Kaufman's deep attachment to Frank Lloyd Wright that in some ways was the germinations for the city's interest in advanced architecture, planning, and to some degree design and art, because honestly the Carnegie International, all the way until the time of Gordon Washburn's arrival, was largely retardataire, not particularly interested in modernist developments in Europe, and probably even less hospitable to those changes in the United States. But with his arrival after the war, the exhibition takes on a great momentum, and in the 1950s in particular, the museum really has very few counterparts, none in the regional museums, in its taste for advanced painting and sculpture, and by inference for design and architecture. And there I would say that Outlines was unusual in its capacity, through Betty Rockwell, to be visionary and empathetic, welcoming, and a patron to such a wide variety of artists, architects, designers, and speakers. So let's say that Kaufman's, Rockwell Outlines, and the Carnegie International under Gordon Washburn is really the timeline of advanced development in the city. Of course, it didn't hurt that important artists were working at Carnegie Tech, and that people of the caliber of Sam Rosenberg, for example, were championing new ways of looking at the world.
Very, very good idea she had. And then was she 20 when she opened the gallery?
And the combination of having all these people that nobody ever heard of in Pittsburgh, and a woman doing it, I think it may have took people aback.
So it's like 1941,
Right.
and we know that there was kind of a traditional perception of like the atomic household, the young American woman. What do you think of Betty? And
Well, obviously I never met her, but she certainly, from everything I've read about her, was ahead of her time in every possible way. A modern woman, just bold and willing to take chances. There were very few men willing to take the kinds of chances that she took. and I'm sure for a woman to do these kinds of things was even more brave and courageous.
She was an early feminist. She had a business of her own and a life of her own and a passion of her own that wasn't just being the woman behind the man. It was not, what we see on TV is how life was in the late 40s and early 50s.
But during the war, women did take a step forward. Women were doing things that they hadn't done before, as you know. I mean, working in factories, but taking jobs that men had done before. So there was a big thing forward. I mean, there were certain definite things we were for in the 40s, definitely, and the art world was, the artists were. So it was uncertainty, but also there was a sense of purpose that was very large. I think it was larger than any time since.
In some ways, it was a very exciting time because for the first time it felt that Europe wasn't in charge and people were starting to experiment and take their own leads on things.
But there was also that feeling of opposition, that we were out of step. Abstraction, you have to realize, in the years of World War II and the immediate, I guess, from the late 1930s to when your grandmother founded the gallery, abstract art was considered communist and un-American, and they were rebels, and they were treated as outlaws. I'm sure her gallery was not welcome when she pushed avant-garde art.
Listen to this. Many years later, we learned a printer upstairs had drilled a hole in his floor to keep track for the FBI of everyone who was coming and going. Of course, we weren't the great communist cell they made us out to be, but they were very interested in what was going on at the gallery and the bookshop.
It was seen as un-American. And if you read art survey books from that time, from the 30s and the 1940s, the early years of our participation in World War II, the attitude in the United States was like Hitler's attitude. Abstract art was an outlawed area. Only here the works weren't burned, but they were, it was hard to get shows, exhibitions, and they really considered themselves avant-garde, meaning, in front of an army, and they were embattled. So the gallery had that overlay of meaning. It wasn't a simple matter of aesthetics. You liked it or you didn't like it. There were very, very strong political overtones.
No, you have to accept the fact that there are always people who don't like what you're doing. On anything, making a speech, or doing a song, or a painting, or anything, there's some who don't like it.
And then the opposition she met. How much of that opposition was against wanting to see what was good in all people, as opposed to saying it's the Americans only that are good, the Germans are not good, the Japanese are no good. There was great Japanese art, there was great German art. And when she had, because I read some of the events she had, they were really something. No wonder she found opposition. And that opposition was against art. That's the thing. And they felt somewhere that she represented some of the best thing in themselves.
Also a very strong anti-intellectual thing in America. It's still here, but it was very strong during the 1940s especially. You weren't supposed to be too intelligent, especially in the arts.
Really? So do you think that is somebody like Betty, a 21-year-old woman who had
I'm sure a lot of people probably had a great deal of suspicion of her and probably contempt. because she was a thinker. You weren't supposed to think in the arts.
What's so impressive, it's not only how ahead of her time she was, but the fact that she was willing to do this in Pittsburgh.
Now, Pittsburgh, you probably didn't expect very much clever design in Pittsburgh in those days. Probably not. Because that's where people wanted some contemporary furniture. They would go to New York, or they would go to Boston, or they would go to any of the other towns that were known for either design or good manufacturing. So Pittsburgh was known as a dirty manufacturing city. It was cold and it was soot. I went through it on a train in the army, and we were covered with soot from just being inside the train.
Just from going through Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Well, you talk to people who were there. There aren't so many left, but it's really true that it was incredibly bad.
When I came to Pittsburgh, it was still called the Smoky City. Of course, all the mills were gone. When the mills were in full blast, Oakland and the Hill, South Side was all covered with orange dust from the sulfur and whatnot, whatever they burned off. Of course, in those days, it was the fashion that people that worked downtown, they always, particularly men, in those days wore white shirts, so everyone took 2 or 3 shirts in case they had a meeting, they could change it to a clean shirt. Of course, Pittsburgh has been cleaned up, it's moved on.
Pittsburgh has grown to become a fantastic city for contemporary art. The Carnegie International has been showing, fantastic exhibitions of contemporary art for, decades and decades. And of course now the Warhol Museum is in Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh is thought of as a great Victorian city, and sometimes people don't realize it evolved very nimbly, particularly after World War II, into a city that was host for many good modern architects, and through the program at Outlines Gallery, host also to a number of very important contemporary artists, filmmakers, dancers, thinkers.
So I think we all kind of came back very humbled, and I felt a great sense of obligation to tell this story. Suddenly it wasn't just about what my late grandmother and grandfather were doing when they were in their early 20s. It was about an entire movement of people who were so creative and so visionary, and who overcame, a great time of turmoil and really contributed to incredible changes in the world.
When you look at the chronology of Outline's achievements, it's astonishing to think that a place that really had no staff, was really the handiwork of one woman, was able to so presciently connect itself to such a variety of really interesting artists who've historically proven to be of great import, both in North America and in Europe after 1940. So it's an astonishing record of ability and willingness to be empathetic and supportive of a broad range of artists. And I think it's inside American art history a little recognized phenomenon. So I'm very happy that there's this opportunity for us to reconsider the force of this one woman's tremendous will to bring a kind of slightly stodgy city into the 20th century. Really, bravo.
became too costly to maintain the gallery.
Usually the reason that these things die is not because they aren't good enough. It's there's not enough money. You spend more money promoting it than you got in.
I think when the gallery closed, she sort of closed down that part of her life. I think by the time the gallery was closing, she had small children and a different focus at home. But I think there was a deep sadness in her that she didn't make a bigger success of it, that it wasn't acknowledged or recognized, and that it wasn't able to continue.
Of course, within a few years, the avant-garde took over and became the establishment.
So Betty had opened Outlines in 1947. Would have been a whole different experience.
Right, she would have been part of the new current.
You know, again, if it had been maybe 3 or 5 years later, it might have been a completely different story.
Would Betty Rockwell, would Outlines have been received differently at a later period? I assume it would have been.
She really had guts.
Yeah, with guts, it was astonishing. It was astonishing.
I do think that she was very unusual. I think she was quite remarkable. And I know, and I'm not being funny when I think it's such a great pity that she didn't have the pleasure of a certain kind of success which she deserved to have.
She shook up the people in Pittsburgh and the vicinity about what art is, and it got closer to the soul of everyone than it had before. I feel that very much.
I think so too. And that the name Betty Raphael, in a way, evoked a feeling. As we talk more about her, I think it evoked a feeling of courage and imagination.
There's something very moving about it. And what's touching to me is her illness, no one knowing about it. The whole thing is quite unusual.
I think it's never too late to acknowledge what a whole group of people have done and, contributed to the world. And I think maybe 72 years, it's given us time to catch up to the avant-garde, and we're finally ready to truly appreciate, what went on at Outlines and during that time period, because it's quite remarkable.
There's a kind of nobility about her failure. Sometimes failures are much more noble than successes. Sometimes.
Outlines relocated several times during the course of its 6-year run. Of the 3 locations, only one remains, the second floor of the Pittsburgh Playhouse. So we've come to the end of the journey, and behind these doors is a place where John Cage and Merce Cunningham performed, where Maya Deren and Joseph Cornell showcased their films for the first time, where social justice advocates such as Langston Hughes lectured, and artists who had been exiled from their own countries were offered refuge to just be who they were. Inside this room, historic events took place, and we may never have known about them were it not for several pieces of paper falling from a book and giving us the opportunity to begin tracing outlines.
And it occurred to me that I shouldn't say this, but I think the problem is with people who are doing this sort of thing, a lack of imagination.
Amen.
They all